The eviction notice taped to Caleb Porter's apartment door gave him 72 hours to vacate, which meant his 7-year-old son Liam would be sleeping in the truck by Friday unless Caleb found a miracle in a bank account that currently held negative $43 after overdraft fees. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Caleb sat in his truck outside the county courthouse on a Wednesday morning in late October, watching people file into the foreclosure auction with the casual interest of bargain hunters who weren't measuring properties against desperation. He'd come with $380, everything left after paying for gas in the storage unit where their belongings had been sitting for 2 months since the landlord had raised rent beyond what unemployment benefits could cover. His construction job had ended when the developer went bankrupt, and the work that had sustained him and Liam since his wife died 3 years ago had dried up like creeks in summer drought. The auction catalog listed 47 properties across the county, most of them residential foreclosures or commercial buildings that required investment Caleb couldn't dream of making. But one listing had caught his attention during a sleepless night spent searching for options that didn't exist. Riverside Lumber Mill, 12 acres including the main mill building, kiln house, and office structure. Minimum bid $425. The property had been abandoned for 20 years, carried liens for back taxes and environmental cleanup, and was located 40 miles into timber country where jobs had disappeared when the logging industry collapsed. It was a terrible investment by any rational measure. But Caleb wasn't looking for investment, he was looking for shelter before his son learned what homelessness felt like. Liam sat beside him working on a coloring book that was 3 months old, its pages creased from being carried everywhere they went. He'd gotten quieter since his mother's death, had learned to read situations and gauge his father's moods with the awareness children develop when stability becomes uncertain. He asked fewer questions now, accepted explanations without pushing for details that would make the truth harder to bear. "Are we going inside?" Liam asked, his voice carrying the careful quality of someone who'd learned not to demand but to inquire. "Yeah, buddy. We're going to try to buy a building." Caleb locked the truck and took Liam's hand, both of them walking into the courthouse with the resignation of people who'd stopped expecting good outcomes but hadn't stopped trying. The auction room was half full, mostly developers and property flippers scanning the catalog for opportunities. The auctioneer moved through residential properties quickly, bidding wars erupting over houses that sold for tens of thousands. Caleb waded through 43 lots before the lumber mill came up, his heart pounding in a way that felt more like panic than hope. Lot 44, Riverside Lumber Mill, the auctioneer announced. 12.7 acres, improvements including mill building approximately 18,000 square feet, kiln house, office building. Property sold as is with all liens and encumbrances. Minimum bid $425. "Do I have $425? Caleb raised his hand, the bid card trembling slightly. "$425, do I have $450? $425 going once, going twice, sold to bidder $217 for $425. The transaction took less than 30 seconds. Caleb signed paperwork in a daze, paid with bills and coins that left him with negative $43 plus whatever the overdraft would become, and received a deed to property he'd never seen that might be his family's salvation or just another disaster in a year that had specialized in disasters. They drove to the lumber mill that afternoon, following county roads that deteriorated from pavement to gravel to dirt as they climbed into foothills where timber operations had once employed thousands. The forest had reclaimed logged areas, second-growth Douglas fir and hemlock covering scars from clear-cutting that had ended before Caleb was born. Abandoned equipment rusted in clearings, old logging roads disappeared into brush, and the few houses they passed looked as defeated as Caleb felt. The lumber mill sat in a valley where a river carved through basalt and cedar, its buildings visible from a quarter-mile away, massive structures that had been built to process entire forests, now standing empty against a backdrop of mountains that didn't care whether industries thrived or died. A chain-link fence surrounded the property, its gate hanging open where someone had cut the padlock years ago. Warning signs about structural hazards and toxic materials were faded to near illegibility. Caleb parked outside the fence, both of them staring at what $425 had bought. The main mill building was enormous, its metal siding corroded, its windows broken, its roof sagging in places that suggested water damage. The kiln house looked more intact but was padlocked with newer hardware. The office building was a gutted shell, its door hanging open, everything inside destroyed by weather and vandals. But it was shelter. Terrible, damaged, possibly dangerous shelter, but it was theirs and it had a roof and it meant Liam wouldn't sleep in the truck or a homeless shelter where childhood ended through exposure to things 7-year-olds shouldn't witness. "Is this where we're going to live?" Liam asked, his voice small. "Temporarily. Until Dad finds work and we can afford something better." Caleb climbed out of the truck, assessing the property with the practical eye of someone who'd spent 15 years in construction. "Come on, let's see what we've got." They walked the perimeter carefully, Caleb noting hazards and structural problems that made the $400 price seem generous rather than cheap. The main mill floor was a disaster, collapsed sections, rusted machinery, rotting lumber, evidence of squatters and vandals. The kiln house was more promising, its concrete construction having weathered abandonment better than the wood and metal structures. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Caleb found keys that fit the kiln house padlock in the deed paperwork, suggesting someone had secured it while leaving the rest of the property open. Inside, the space was surprisingly intact, old kilns that had been used to dry lumber, a concrete floor that was cracked but solid, walls that showed minimal water damage. It smelled of cedar and time, of industrial work that had ended before Liam was born. More importantly, there was a small office area in one corner with a working door, intact windows, and evidence that someone had used it as living space at some point. A cot, some canned goods, a propane camping stove. The supplies were old but the space was dry and secure, better than sleeping in the truck. "We can stay here tonight," Caleb said, more to himself than to Liam. "Tomorrow I'll figure out water and electricity and what we need to make this actually livable." They spent the afternoon cleaning the office space, moving the cot so Liam could sleep while Caleb took the floor. As sunset painted the valley in shades of amber and rose, Caleb explored the kiln house more thoroughly, looking for anything useful or valuable. He found old tools, some copper wiring that might be worth selling for scrap, maintenance logs from the mill's final years of operation. And he found something else. Behind one of the kilns, partially hidden by old lumber, was a section of wall that didn't quite match the rest. The concrete was slightly different in color, showed seams that suggested it had been poured separately. Caleb pushed on it experimentally and felt movement, not collapse but deliberate give, like a door designed to look like solid wall. He found the mechanism after 15 minutes of searching, a lever disguised as a pipe fitting, positioned where someone who knew it was there could access it but casual inspection would miss it. When he pulled the lever, a section of wall swung inward on hidden hinges, revealing a space maybe 10 feet square that had been sealed off from the rest of the kiln house. The room was dry and dark, lit only by Caleb's phone flashlight. Its walls were lined with metal shelving holding plastic storage containers. A desk sat in the center with a chair, both covered in dust but undamaged. And on the desk was an envelope with words written in fading ink, "For whoever buys this property honestly." Caleb's hands shook as he opened the envelope. Inside was a letter written in careful script, dated September 1995. "If you're reading this, you've bought Riverside Lumber Mill at foreclosure auction, which means you probably paid almost nothing and are wondering what you've gotten yourself into. My name is Samuel Crane. I built this mill in 1967, ran it for 28 years before the timber industry collapsed and took my livelihood with it. I'm sealing this room today knowing the bank will eventually foreclose, knowing someone will buy this property for pennies, hoping that person understands what I'm trusting them with. The containers on the shelves hold $600,000 in currency, bonds, and gold that I converted from my life's savings over the final years of the mill's operation. I don't trust banks after watching them destroy the logging industry through policies that favor corporations over family operations. I don't trust my relatives who abandoned this place the moment profit margins tightened. I trust the land and the buildings I built and the possibility that someone desperate enough to buy a foreclosed lumber mill might be desperate enough to use this fortune better than I did. The combination to the safe is your deed number. The money is legitimate, all taxes paid through 1995, though you'll face estate and inheritance complications when you claim it. There's enough here to change your life if you're smart, to waste if you're foolish, to fight over if you're unlucky. Use it to build something, not just to survive. Build connections, build community, build the kind of life that running this mill alone never gave me. One warning: the Prescott family has been circling this property for 30 years, waiting for the foreclosure they knew was coming. They own most of the timber operations that didn't collapse, and they've wanted this land because it controls river access that's valuable for log transport. They'll pressure you to sell within days of learning you bought the property. Don't. Not because the land is so valuable you shouldn't sell, but because giving in to people like the Prescotts teaches the next generation that power and patience win over honest ownership. I'm 73 years old and dying of cancer that started in my lungs from breathing sawdust for 3 decades. I'll be gone before the foreclosure happens, which is probably mercy. But I'm leaving this for you, whoever you are, because someone should benefit from 40 years of work that I couldn't sustain and heirs I had didn't deserve. Make better choices than I did. Build family instead of business. And remember that the greatest wealth isn't what you accumulate but what you give away to people who need chances you once needed. Samuel Crane, September 17, 1995. Caleb read the letter 3 times, his mind struggling to process what he'd found. $600,000. Hidden in a lumber mill he'd bought for $425. Left by a man who'd died almost 30 years ago trusting that whoever bought his foreclosed property would use it better than he had. He opened the first container with shaking hands, finding exactly what Samuel's letter promised: stacks of currency in denominations that had changed design since 1995, bonds with maturity dates decades past, small bars of gold wrapped in protective cloth. The other containers held more of the same, a fortune that Samuel Crane had converted from business assets and hidden in a room he'd sealed with the hope that his trust wouldn't be misplaced. Caleb stood in the hidden room holding evidence of more money than he'd earned in his entire life, thinking about Liam sleeping in the Kiln House office, about the eviction notice that had given them 72 hours, about the negative $43 in his bank account. Samuel Crane had been right about desperation. Caleb was desperate enough to buy a foreclosed lumber mill, and now he held the answer to every financial problem that had kept him awake for months. But he also held complications. Estate taxes on money that was almost 30 years old. Inheritance questions about claiming a fortune from someone he'd never met. Legal challenges from the Prescott family Samuel had warned about. And the fundamental question of whether he could actually keep what he'd found or whether discovering it had just created problems that would destroy the small chance at stability he'd been hoping for. He was photographing the letter and documenting the containers when he heard a vehicle approaching outside. Caleb quickly closed the hidden door, returned the lever to its disguised position, and walked out of the Kiln House to find a black SUV parked beside his truck. 2 men stood near the fence, both wearing expensive outdoor gear that marked them as people who visited rural property rather than lived on it. The older man, maybe 60, stepped forward with the confident bearing of someone used to being listened to. "I'm Thomas Prescott. This is my son David. We heard someone finally bought the old Crane mill at auction. Wanted to come by and welcome you to the area." Caleb recognized the name from Samuel's letter, felt his instincts flare with warning. Caleb Porter. Just took possession today. You got a hell of a deal. $425 for 12 acres and all these buildings. Thomas smiled, but the expression didn't reach his eyes. Of course, the property has liens and environmental issues that probably weren't explained clearly at auction. Cleanup costs alone will run you $50,000 to $70,000, and the county's been trying to force remediation for years. I'll deal with that when I need to. Or you could avoid the headache entirely. We're prepared to offer you $5,000 for the property right now. That's more than 10 times what you paid, and it saves you from environmental liabilities you probably can't afford to address. Thomas pulled out a business card. Think about it. We've been waiting for this property to come available for a long time. We're motivated buyers. I'm not looking to sell. Just bought the place." David Prescott spoke for the first time, his tone less diplomatic than his father's. "Mr. Porter, you don't know what you've bought. This mill has been toxic for 30 years. The timber treatment chemicals alone make it a Superfund candidate. You're a single father living in your truck with a kid who shouldn't be exposed to this environment. Taking our offer is the smart play." The casual mention of Liam, the knowledge of Caleb's circumstances, sent a chill down his spine. They'd researched him between the auction and now, had learned enough to know he was vulnerable. The friendly welcome was actually strategic pressure, delivered with smiles but carrying implicit threats. "How do you know I have a son? Small county. Word travels." Thomas's smile stayed fixed. "Look, we're not trying to pressure you. But you should understand what you're facing before you make decisions about a property that's been bleeding money and problems for 3 decades. Our offer is generous for what this place is actually worth." After they left, Caleb stood in the gathering dusk looking at the lumber mill that was either his salvation or another disaster. He'd found $600,000 hidden by a man who'd warned that the Prescotts would come within days. Samuel Crane had been dead for almost 30 years, but his prediction had been accurate. They'd shown up within hours, armed with knowledge and offers and implied threats designed to make Caleb surrender before he even understood what he'd bought. But Caleb also understood something the Prescotts didn't. He'd spent 3 years raising Liam alone after his wife's death, had survived unemployment and eviction and the grinding pressure of poverty that tested whether you'd surrender or persist. He'd bought this property out of desperation, but desperation had taught him that sometimes the only choice was to stand ground even when standing looked impossible. Inside the kiln house, Liam was still sleeping, unaware that his father had found a fortune or that people were already circling to take it. Caleb stood at the threshold between the office and the hidden room, between the life they'd been living and the one Samuel Crane's trust had made possible, knowing that the next decisions would determine whether that trust had been placed wisely or whether he'd just discovered that some opportunities were traps disguised as salvation. The lumber mill held its secrets in the darkness, the river flowed past with the same indifference it had shown to Samuel Crane's failure and Caleb's desperation, and somewhere in the valley the Prescotts were planning their next move in a campaign they'd been waiting 30 years to execute. Caleb had 72 hours before the eviction took effect, $600,000 hidden behind a false wall, and a 7-year-old son whose childhood depended on whether his father had the courage to fight for inheritance he hadn't earned but had been trusted with anyway. The night settled over the property like a held breath, and Caleb made the decision that would change everything. He wouldn't surrender, wouldn't take the $5,000, wouldn't teach Liam that powerful people got what they wanted when they applied enough pressure. Whatever came next, whatever complications claiming Samuel's fortune created, he'd face it by standing ground rather than retreating from battles that might define what his son learned about courage and compromise. The lumber mill waited in darkness, holding wealth and danger in equal measure, and Caleb committed himself to protecting what a dying man had trusted him with, even though he didn't yet understand the full cost of that commitment or whether Samuel Crane's faith in desperate strangers would prove justified or tragically misplaced. Caleb waited until morning to contact a lawyer, spending the night documenting everything in the hidden room with his phone camera while Liam slept. By dawn, he had photographs of Samuel Crane's letter, every container, sample bills showing serial numbers and dates, the bonds with their maturity information. He'd also found something else, a metal box containing Samuel's personal records, tax returns showing legitimate income from the lumber mill through 1994, documentation that the money had been earned and taxed properly before being converted to physical assets. The lawyer he found was named Helen Martinez, practicing in the county seat 30 miles away. Her office was above a hardware store, and her rates were posted on a sign that read "Payment plans available." Nobody turned away for inability to pay up front. Caleb brought Liam because he had nowhere else to leave him, both of them sitting in Helen's office that smelled of old paper and coffee while she reviewed the photographs and documentation. "This is extraordinary," Helen said after 20 minutes of silence. "You bought foreclosed property for $425 and found $600,000 in assets hidden by the previous owner who died almost 30 years ago. The legal complications are going to be significant. Can I keep it? Legally? Eventually, probably yes. You own the property, the fortune was on your property, and Samuel Crane's letter makes clear he intended it for whoever bought the mill. But the process will be complex. We'll need to petition to reopen Samuel's estate posthumously, establish that he had no living heirs with legitimate claims, pay estate taxes and penalties on the 30-year gap, and defend against challenges from anyone who might contest your right to claim found assets. Helen paused. That process will take months minimum, will cost tens of thousands in legal fees, and will make your discovery public record. The Prescott family already knows I bought the property. They showed up yesterday offering to buy it. Helen's expression shifted, recognition and concern crossing her face. Thomas Prescott? Him and his son David. They offered $5,000, said the environmental cleanup would cost more than I could afford. The Prescotts have been acquiring timber properties in this region for 40 years. They're persistent, well-resourced, and they have a reputation for getting what they want through legal pressure that's technically legitimate but ethically questionable. Helen pulled out a file. I've represented 3 property owners in disputes with them over the years. They use the same pattern: friendly initial offer, escalating legal challenges, sustained pressure designed to make fighting more expensive than selling. Samuel's letter warned me about them specifically. Samuel Crane was smart to do that. The Prescotts wanted his mill for river access even when it was operational. They'll want it more now that they know someone bought it for pennies at auction. Helen met Caleb's eyes. If they learn about the fortune you found, they'll claim Samuel owed them money or had agreements that give them rights to the property. They'll manufacture legal complications that force you to spend the fortune just defending your right to keep it. Caleb felt the weight of impossible choices settling on him. What do I do? You can sell them the property for whatever they're offering and walk away with a small profit. Or you can fight to claim Samuel's fortune, which means expensive legal proceedings, sustained pressure from the Prescotts, and months or years of uncertainty. Helen's voice softened. You have a young son and no steady income. Fighting might cost more than you can sustain even if you eventually win. After leaving Helen's office, Caleb drove back to the lumber mill with Liam, both of them quiet. The property looked different in daylight, less threatening but more desolate, the scale of its abandonment clearer. He'd spent the morning learning that finding $600,000 didn't mean having $600,000, that the gap between discovery and actually claiming what you'd found could be measured in legal fees and years of fighting. They were unloading supplies Caleb had bought on credit, camping equipment, food, basic tools for making the kiln house livable, when a sheriff's deputy pulled up to the gate. The deputy approached with the careful neutrality of someone delivering official business. Caleb Porter? I have a court summons for you. He handed over an envelope. You've been named in a civil complaint filed by Prescott Timber Operations regarding environmental violations and hazardous conditions at this property. You're required to appear for a hearing next week. After the deputy left, Caleb opened the summons to find exactly what Helen had predicted. The Prescotts were claiming that the lumber mill contained toxic chemicals from timber treatment operations, that these constituted environmental hazards requiring immediate remediation, that Caleb as the new owner was liable for cleanup costs estimated at $60,000 to $80,000. The complaint requested a court order forcing either immediate cleanup or sale of the property to parties willing to address the violations. The strategy was transparent: create legal obligations Caleb couldn't meet, force him to either spend money he didn't have or sell to the only buyers offering to purchase property with environmental liabilities. They'd filed the complaint within 24 hours of learning he'd bought the mill, had moved with the speed of people who'd been planning this response for years. Liam watched his father read the summons, his 7-year-old face showing worry he tried to hide. Are we in trouble? Some people want us to leave this place. They're using the law to pressure us. Caleb knelt beside his son, choosing honesty over false reassurance. It's going to be hard, buddy. We're going to have to fight to stay here, and fighting costs money we don't have yet. Because of what you found in the secret room? Caleb had shown Liam the hidden room that morning, had explained that the previous owner had left money for them but that claiming it would be complicated. Liam had processed this with the acceptance children develop when their lives have been unstable, one more strange turn in a year that had specialized in strange turns. Yeah. The money could change everything for us, but only if we can hold on to the property long enough to actually claim it. Caleb pulled Liam close. I need you to understand something. This is going to get harder before it gets easier. We might have to sleep in this kiln house for months. We might face people trying to scare us into leaving. If you want to stop, if you want me to just sell and find us somewhere simpler, I'll do it. This is your life too. Liam was quiet for a long moment before answering. Mom used to say we don't quit when things get hard. She said the porters stand for things even when standing hurts. The words hit Caleb like physical force. His wife had said that constantly, had lived by that principle until cancer had given her a fight she couldn't win through stubbornness alone. She'd made Caleb promise he'd teach Liam the same lesson, that quitting when challenged was its own kind of death. Okay then, Caleb said. We stand. Over the following days, Caleb worked to make the kiln house actually livable while preparing for legal battles he couldn't afford. He installed a camping shower using river water and a portable heater, set up a propane stove for cooking, created a space that wasn't comfortable but was functional. Liam helped with child-sized determination, organizing their clothes, setting up his school supplies, treating their situation as an adventure rather than a crisis. But the pressure escalated quickly. Thomas Prescott called twice offering increased payments, first $8,000, then $12,000, each offer presented as generous given the property's liabilities. When Caleb refused both, the calls stopped and the legal filings increased. The Prescotts filed complaints with the county health department about unsafe living conditions for a minor. They filed liens claiming Samuel Crane had owed their company money for timber sales that were never paid. They contacted Caleb's former employer claiming he'd stolen tools, a baseless allegation designed to damage his reputation. Helen worked to counter each filing, but the costs mounted. Within 2 weeks, Caleb had legal bills exceeding $15,000, all of it on payment plans that assumed eventual access to Samuel's fortune. But accessing that fortune required winning the estate proceedings, which required surviving the Prescott's pressure campaign, which required money he was spending faster than he could find work to replace it. He took day labor jobs when he could find them, leaving Liam with a neighbor woman who'd offered help after learning their situation. The work was inconsistent and poorly paid, barely covering food while the legal fees accumulated. Caleb lived on 4 hours of sleep, worked 12-hour days when jobs were available, spent evenings in the kiln house teaching Liam math and reading by camping lantern because the mill had no electricity. 3 weeks after buying the property, a journalist named Robert Chin contacted Caleb. He'd been investigating the Prescott's acquisition practices for a regional newspaper, had learned about the lumber mill case through court filings, wanted to know if Caleb would talk about the pressure campaign. They met at a diner 40 miles from the mill, Caleb bringing documentation of every filing, every offer, every tactic the Prescotts had used. Robert listened with the focused attention of someone who'd heard similar stories before. The Prescotts have been doing this for decades, Robert explained. They identify properties they want, they wait for financial distress or foreclosure, then they pressure new owners through legal tactics that are technically legitimate but practically abusive. You're the first person in 5 years who's refused to settle. I can't afford to keep refusing much longer. The legal costs are destroying me. What if we make those costs public? Document the Prescott's tactics, show the pattern of pressure they use against property owners who can't fight back. Robert pulled out a notebook. I can't win your legal battles, but I can make them fight in the court of public opinion where they're not used to being challenged. Caleb thought about this, about whether publicity would help or just escalate the conflict. What do I need to do? Tell me everything. The foreclosure auction, what you found on the property, Samuel Crane's letter, every interaction with the Prescotts. Let me document this so it's not just another property dispute but a story about how powerful families use the legal system against people who can't afford to defend themselves. The article appeared 2 weeks later, front page of the regional newspaper's Sunday edition. Timber empire built on pressure, how one family acquires property through legal intimidation. Robert had documented 5 cases over 10 years where the Prescotts had used similar tactics, had included Caleb's story alongside others, had made the pattern impossible to ignore. The response was immediate and divided. Some readers supported Caleb, donated money to a legal fund Helen established, expressed outrage at tactics that looked like legalized theft. Others defended the Prescotts as legitimate business operators, criticized Caleb for refusing fair offers, suggested he was exploiting sympathy to avoid responsibility for property he couldn't afford to maintain. But the article did something Robert had predicted: it forced the Prescotts to change tactics. Thomas Prescott called the newspaper claiming defamation, threatened lawsuits, demanded retractions. The attention made their aggressive filings look worse, made judges scrutinize their claims more carefully, created pressure they weren't used to dealing with. It also made them escalate in ways Robert hadn't anticipated. Caleb was working on the kiln house roof when a state environmental inspector arrived, clipboard in hand, explaining that anonymous complaints had triggered mandatory inspection of the property's chemical contamination. The inspection took 4 hours, the inspector documenting every visible stain, every rusted drum, every area that might contain toxic residue from 3 decades of timber treatment operations. The report arrived a week later. The property contained contamination from chromate copper arsenate, a wood preservative used until the 1980s that was now classified as hazardous waste. Cleanup would require certified remediation, estimated cost between $70,000 and $90,000. The county gave Caleb 90 days to submit a remediation plan or face forced sale of the property to cover cleanup costs. Helen called it a checkmate move. They've manufactured a legal obligation you can't meet. Even if you access Samuel's fortune tomorrow, a significant portion will go to environmental cleanup. And you can't access the fortune without defending the property, which you can't do if the county forces a sale. There has to be a way to fight this. There is, but it requires money you don't have and time the county won't give you. Helen's voice carried exhaustion. Caleb, I've been doing this for 20 years. I know when a fight is winnable and when it's designed to be unwinnable. The Prescotts have deeper resources, more patience, and they've been planning this for 3 decades. You've been fighting for 6 weeks. That night, Caleb sat in the kiln house with Liam sleeping nearby, Samuel Crane's letter in his hands. The dying lumber baron had trusted that whoever bought his property would use the fortune to build something meaningful, would stand against the Prescotts' pressure, would prove worthy of the chance Samuel was offering. But Samuel had been a successful businessman with resources and knowledge. Caleb was an unemployed construction worker with a 7-year-old son and negative dollars in his bank account. Maybe trust had been misplaced. Maybe some battles were lost before they started because the other side had advantages that rendered courage irrelevant. He was considering Thomas Prescott's latest offer, $20,000 for the property, release from all environmental liabilities, confidentiality agreement preventing him from discussing the terms, when Liam woke up and found him at the desk. "Are you giving up?" Liam asked quietly. "I'm thinking about whether fighting is fair to you. Whether I have the right to keep us living like this when I could take money that would give us stability." Liam climbed into his father's lap, small and warm and trusting. The man who left the money said to build connections and community. He said the greatest wealth is what you give away to people who need chances. We needed a chance, and he gave us one. If we quit because it's hard, we're saying chances don't matter when they cost something. The simple clarity of his son's words cut through Caleb's exhaustion and doubt. Liam was 7 years old and understood what fighting meant better than Caleb had given him credit for. His wife had been right, the Porters stood for things even when standing hurt, taught the next generation that some principles mattered more than comfort. But standing required more than principle. It required a strategy that could actually win rather than just resist until resources ran out. Caleb called Robertson the next morning with a proposition. "You documented the Prescotts' tactics. Can you help me document Samuel Crane's life? Show who he was, what the lumber mill meant, why his trust in desperate strangers deserves protection." Robert understood immediately. "You want to make this about more than property rights. You want to make it about honoring a legacy. Samuel spent 40 years building something, died knowing it would be foreclosed, left his fortune trusting someone would use it better than he had. That story deserves to be told, and the Prescotts' attempt to steal it through legal pressure deserves to be exposed. The second article appeared 3 days before the county hearing on environmental remediation. A dying man's trust, the legacy fight over Riverside Lumber Mill. Robert had found Samuel's relatives, interviewed them about his final years, documented how he'd chosen to leave his fortune for strangers rather than family who'd abandoned the mill when profit margins tightened. The article included Samuel's letter in full, made the trust he'd placed in whoever bought the property feel personal and urgent. The response overwhelmed Caleb. Donations to the legal fund increased. People who'd known Samuel contacted Helen offering testimony about his character and intentions. Environmental engineers volunteered to assess the property and challenge the county's cleanup estimates. The story had transformed from property dispute into something larger, a question about whether powerful families could use legal systems to steal from people who couldn't afford to defend themselves, whether dying wishes deserved protection, whether trust placed in strangers was noble or naive. The county hearing was scheduled for a Wednesday morning in mid-December, 6 weeks after Caleb had bought the lumber mill. He arrived with Helen, with Liam, with documentation and witnesses and the weight of knowing this might be the moment that determined everything. The hearing room was packed, supporters, journalists, the Prescotts with their lawyers, county officials who looked uncomfortable with the attention this small case had attracted. Thomas Prescott testified first, presenting the environmental report, arguing that the contamination posed public health risks that required immediate professional remediation. His testimony was clinical and persuasive, focused on legal obligations and safety standards that Caleb clearly couldn't meet. Then Helen presented her case. She called environmental engineers who testified that the contamination was real but overstated, that phased cleanup over several years would cost significantly less than the county's estimate. She presented Samuel Crane's tax records showing he'd operated the mill in compliance with all regulations through 1994, that any contamination had occurred under previous owners in the 1950s and 60s. She called Samuel's former employees who testified about his character, his commitment to safety, his careful documentation of everything. And she called Caleb, who testified about buying the property out of desperation, about finding Samuel's letter and fortune, about the choice to honor trust placed in him rather than surrender to pressure from people who'd been waiting decades to acquire the land. "Mr. Porter," the county attorney asked during cross-examination, "you've been offered $20,000 for this property. That's more than 40 times what you paid. Why refuse an offer that would solve your financial problems and transfer environmental liability to parties better equipped to handle it?" Caleb looked at Liam sitting in the front row, at the journalists documenting every word, at Thomas Prescott watching with the confidence of someone who'd never lost a battle like this. "Because Samuel Crane trusted me," Caleb said quietly. "He didn't know me, had no reason to believe I'd be worthy of that trust. But he left his life savings hoping the person desperate enough to buy a foreclosed lumber mill would be desperate enough to stand for something when standing mattered. Teaching my son that we quit when powerful people pressure us would dishonor that trust more than any environmental violation could." The hearing lasted 6 hours. The county board deliberated for 2, then returned with a decision that split the difference. They'd grant Caleb 18 months to complete phased environmental remediation, would accept a cleanup plan that spread costs over time, would monitor progress but wouldn't force immediate sale. It wasn't complete victory, but it was survival, time to actually claim Samuel's fortune and use it for the cleanup the county required. Outside the courthouse, Thomas Prescott approached Caleb with an expression that mixed frustration and grudging respect. "You should have taken my first offer," Thomas said. "Would have saved yourself months of fighting and legal fees that consumed money you needed for your son. Or I would have taught my son that standing for principles only matters when standing is convenient. Samuel Crane warned me about you in his letter. He understood exactly how this would play out. Samuel Crane died alone and broke, and his mill was foreclosed. That's not a legacy worth honoring. He died trusting that someone would use his fortune to build what he couldn't. That trust is worth honoring even if his business failed. Caleb met Thomas's eyes. "You're going to lose this fight eventually. Not because I'm stronger or smarter, but because people are watching now. Your tactics work when they're private. They fail when they're public." Thomas Prescott walked away without responding, and Caleb knew the fight was far from over. But he'd survived the first major battle, had bought time to claim Samuel's fortune, had proven to Liam and himself that standing ground was possible when you were stubborn enough and lucky enough and willing to accept help from people who believed your fight mattered. The lumber mill waited in winter darkness, its buildings holding secrets that had survived 3 decades, its hidden room containing wealth that was slowly becoming accessible. Caleb had fought for 6 weeks and would fight for months more, would face continued pressure and legal complications and the grinding uncertainty of battles that tested whether you'd surrender or persist. But he'd honored Samuel Crane's trust by refusing to give up, had taught Liam that legacy mattered more than comfort, had proven that sometimes desperate people given impossible chances rose to meet them in ways that justified the faith placed in them. The land remembered everything, and now it would remember that when one dying man trusted a desperate stranger, that stranger had chosen to stand rather than surrender, to build rather than retreat, to honor inheritance through fighting for it rather than simply accepting whatever powerful people decided it was worth. The 18 months following the county hearing were harder than the initial fight, a grinding reality that tested whether Caleb's commitment to honoring Samuel's trust would survive the actual work required to transform principle into practice. The court's decision had given him time, but time without resources was just extended struggle, and claiming Samuel's fortune required navigating legal processes that moved with bureaucratic patience while his bank account remained stubbornly empty. Helen Martinez filed the petition to reopen Samuel Crane's estate 3 days after the hearing, beginning a process that would consume 8 months of documentation, court appearances, and challenges from parties claiming interest in a dead man's fortune. The state required proof that Samuel had no living heirs with legitimate claims, verification that the money had been legally earned and properly taxed through 1995, assessment of estate taxes and penalties on the 30-year gap between Samuel's death and the fortune's discovery. Each requirement cost money Caleb didn't have, created delays that forced him to survive on day labor and credit that was harder to maintain as months passed without resolution. He worked construction jobs when he could find them, left Liam with neighbors who'd become family through shared struggle, spent evenings in the kiln house teaching his son homework by camping lantern while trying not to show the exhaustion that made sleep feel impossible. But something unexpected sustained them through those months. The community that had rallied during the county hearing didn't disappear when the immediate crisis passed. People brought food, offered work, helped with Liam's care in ways that revealed small towns could support their own when the struggle felt worthy. The church ladies who'd read Robert Chen's articles organized a fundraiser that paid for 3 months of Helen's legal fees. The retired logger who'd worked for Samuel in the 1980s volunteered to help document the mill's history for the estate proceedings. The hardware store owner extended credit for supplies Caleb needed to make the kiln house actually livable for a growing boy. Margaret Whitfield became particularly important during this period. Samuel's former bookkeeper was 72 years old, moved with the careful deliberation of someone whose joints remembered too many Vermont winters, but her memory of the mill's operations in Samuel's final years was sharp and detailed. She spent hours with Helen documenting Samuel's business practices, proving that the fortune had been accumulated legally, that taxes had been paid on income before it was converted to physical assets. Samuel was meticulous about records, Margaret explained during one of many meetings in Helen's office. He didn't trust banks or government, but he also wouldn't break laws. Every dollar in that hidden room came from legitimate lumber sales, properly taxed through the year he sealed the chamber. His paranoia was about protection, not evasion. But Margaret also revealed harder truths about the man whose trust Caleb had inherited. Samuel chose the mill over everything: his marriage, his children, his health. His wife left in 1982 because he wouldn't consider selling even when timber prices collapsed and the business was clearly dying. His kids moved away because growing up here meant watching their father sacrifice family for an industry that didn't love him back. By the end, he was running the mill alone, refusing help, refusing to admit that holding on was costing more than letting go. Why did he do it? Caleb asked. If the business was failing and his family was gone, why keep fighting? Because the mill was his identity. Without it, he was just a man who'd lost everything that mattered. With it, he could tell himself the sacrifice had meaning, that building something from nothing proved worth, even if that worth came at the cost of relationships. Margaret's expression showed the sadness of someone who'd watched a friend destroy himself through stubbornness disguised as principle. Samuel's letter to you was his attempt to correct that mistake through someone else. He wanted whoever found his fortune to build connections he'd failed to build, to use wealth for community rather than isolation. The estate proceedings stretched through fall and winter, each month bringing new requirements and complications. The Prescotts filed a claim asserting Samuel had owed their company money for timber sales, a fabrication designed to create liens against the fortune. A distant cousin appeared claiming to be Samuel's heir, requiring DNA testing and genealogical research to disprove. The IRS required extensive documentation before accepting that 30-year-old assets could be claimed by someone who'd bought the property at foreclosure. Helen navigated each challenge with the patient competence of someone who understood that legal victories were built through accumulated small wins rather than dramatic reversals. But the process consumed her time at rates Caleb couldn't afford to pay, creating debt that would need to be settled from the fortune if he ever actually accessed it. By month 6, he owed Helen over $40,000, the hardware store $12,000, and various other creditors amounts that totaled a burden he couldn't carry indefinitely. Liam turned 8 during this period, celebrated his birthday in the Kiln house with a cake made by neighbors and presents that were practical rather than extravagant. He'd adapted to their circumstances with the resilience children develop when stability becomes uncertain, had learned to read his father's moods and offer help in small ways that revealed wisdom beyond his years. School became his refuge, the one place where routines were predictable and expectations were clear. But he also absorbed lessons Caleb was teaching through survival rather than intention. That fighting for principles cost more than money. That community mattered when family was absent or insufficient. That wealth measured through what you had was different from wealth measured through what you built and who stood beside you when building became hard. The environmental cleanup began in month 7, phased remediation that would span 3 years according to the plan the county had accepted. Caleb hired contractors who specialized in hazardous waste removal, watched them excavate contaminated soil from areas where chromate copper arsenate had leached into the ground over decades of timber treatment operations. The work was expensive, $30,000 for the first phase alone, money he paid with credit secured against the fortune he still couldn't access. But the cleanup also revealed something unexpected. Beneath the contaminated layers, the land was rich and fertile, soil that had been protected from agricultural use by the mill's industrial operations. An environmental engineer mentioned casually that once remediation was complete, the property would be suitable for restoration plantings, could support native forests that would recover quickly with proper management. The observation planted an idea that would shape everything Caleb eventually built. The lumber mill property wasn't just industrial ruins to be preserved as history, it was land that could be healed, that could demonstrate what recovery looked like when you invested in restoration rather than just extraction. Month 9 brought the breakthrough they'd been working toward. The probate court ruled in Caleb's favor, recognizing him as the legitimate claimant to Samuel's fortune as finder and property owner, dismissing all competing claims as either fraudulent or legally insufficient. The ruling established that the $600,000 belonged to Caleb subject to estate taxes and penalties that the court assessed at $195,000. The remaining $405,000 represented life-changing wealth for someone who'd been homeless 8 months earlier. But it also represented obligation, to Samuel's trust, to the community that had supported him, to Liam who'd watched his father fight battles that could have been avoided through surrender. Caleb received the funds in month 10, a bank transfer that transformed his account from negative overdraft to more money than he'd earned in 15 years of construction work. The first thing he did was pay Helen in full, settling $47,000 in legal fees that she'd accumulated while working largely on faith. The second was to complete the first phase environmental cleanup, ensuring the county's remediation requirements would be met on schedule. The third was to establish an education fund for Liam, securing his future regardless of what else happened. What remained, roughly $200,000 after immediate obligations, became the foundation for transformation that would take years to complete. Caleb could have used it for personal comfort, could have bought a house and reliable vehicles and the middle-class security he'd never known. Instead, he chose to honor Samuel's instructions about building connections and community, about using wealth to create rather than simply to possess. He established the Samuel Crane Legacy Fund with an initial endowment of $75,000, structured so the principal would grow while interest funded ongoing programs. The fund's mission was direct: support families facing foreclosure, provide legal assistance to property owners being pressured by larger interests, offer educational opportunities to children of timber workers whose industry had disappeared. The programs operated through applications that required proof of need but not proof of deservingness, following Samuel's principle that desperate people should be given chances rather than judgment. The remaining $125,000 funded the slow work of transforming the lumber mill from industrial ruins into something that served present purposes while preserving historical memory. Caleb hired contractors to stabilize buildings that could be saved, to properly demolish structures that were beyond repair, to create spaces that could be used for workshops and community gatherings and the kind of activities that built connections Samuel had never managed. The main mill building was too damaged and too expensive to fully restore, but portions of it could be converted to workshop spaces with proper investment. Caleb worked with architects who specialized in adaptive reuse, people who understood how to respect industrial heritage while creating functional modern spaces. They designed workshops that would house craftspeople and small manufacturers, spaces affordable enough to support the kinds of businesses that couldn't compete with commercial rents but that added vitality to rural communities struggling with economic transition. The Kiln House became the project's heart, part museum documenting the timber industry's history in the region, part community center hosting events and programs, part memorial to Samuel Crane and the lessons his life taught about the cost of choosing work over relationships. Caleb worked with Margaret to curate exhibits that told honest stories rather than romanticized narratives, showing both the skill and the sacrifice that logging had required, both the prosperity and the environmental damage it had caused. But the transformation wasn't just physical. Through the process of building, Caleb built relationships that changed him from isolated survivor to connected community member. He joined the town council, contributed to local schools, showed up for volunteer days and town meetings and the small commitments that made rural places function. He coached Liam's soccer team even though he knew nothing about soccer, learning alongside the kids in ways that revealed parenting was often about showing up rather than expertise. The Prescotts' pressure continued but diminished over the months following the estate settlement. They filed one more lawsuit claiming environmental damages entitled them to compensation, a transparent attempt to create liens against Caleb's remaining funds. The suit was dismissed quickly, the judge noting that the Prescotts' pattern of harassing litigation was becoming documented and potentially sanctionable. Thomas Prescott called Caleb once more, 15 months after the county hearing, his tone different from their previous conversations. Not friendly exactly, but less adversarial, carrying exhaustion that suggested the fight had cost him more than he'd anticipated. "You won," Thomas said without preamble. "The estate is settled, the property is yours, and continued litigation would just waste money neither of us needs to waste. I'm withdrawing all Prescott claims and ceasing any efforts to acquire the mill property." "Why now?" "You spent decades waiting for this property to be available." "Because watching you refuse to quit made me reckon with tactics I've used for 40 years, methods my father taught me and his father taught him. We justified aggressive acquisition as business strategy, told ourselves that timber operations required taking what weaker parties couldn't hold. But you held. With a 7-year-old son and negative dollars in your bank account, you stood ground. I thought money and patience would eventually win." Thomas was quiet for a moment. That kind of stubbornness deserves respect more than continued opposition. After Thomas hung up, Caleb sat in the Kiln House office that had become his temporary home, thinking about the conversation. The Prescotts' withdrawal wasn't moral epiphany so much as pragmatic recognition that continued fighting served no purpose. But the result was the same, peace that allowed him to focus on building rather than defending, creation rather than protection. 2 years after buying the lumber mill, Caleb and Liam moved from the Kiln House into a small home he'd purchased near the property. The house was modest but solid, had enough space for Liam to have his own room, represented stability that felt almost foreign after years of uncertainty. Liam decorated his room with artwork he'd created, books he'd collected, evidence of a childhood that was finally being lived rather than just survived. "This is really ours?" Liam asked on moving day, exploring rooms that didn't smell like camping gear in industrial buildings. "We're not going to have to leave?" "It's really ours. Paid for, no rent, no landlord who can decide we're inconvenient." Caleb pulled his son close, feeling the weight of 2 years settle into something approaching relief. "You'll grow up here, buddy. Go to high school here, bring friends home here, have a childhood that's not about moving every few months." The transformation of the lumber mill property continued over the following years, phased work that respected both budget constraints and the complexity of converting industrial buildings to community use. Local craftspeople helped with construction in exchange for workshop spaces, creating ownership that went beyond Caleb's investment into shared commitment to the project's success. The workshops opened gradually, first woodworking spaces, then metalworking, then studios for artists and makers who'd been priced out of commercial rents elsewhere. Margaret Whitfield worked tirelessly on the museum, cataloging artifacts from the mill's operational years, interviewing former workers who remembered when timber was the region's primary industry, creating exhibits that taught younger generations about work that had shaped their communities before economic forces moved on. She insisted on including Samuel's story with all its complications, his skill and his isolation, his success and his failures, his final trust that someone would use his fortune better than he had. "People need to know the whole truth," Margaret said when Caleb questioned whether they should share the harder parts of Samuel's history. "The museum isn't here to make him look noble. It's here to show that building industries without building community creates wealth that doesn't satisfy, that success measured only through production is failure when it costs you relationships with everyone who matters." 3 years after the foreclosure auction, the lumber mill hosted its first community event, a timber heritage festival that drew former loggers, mill workers, and families whose histories were entwined with the industry's rise and collapse. Older men told stories about working forests that seemed endless, about falling trees that took 4 people to cut, about timber camps and river drives and the careful skill required to turn standing forests into finished lumber without modern equipment. Younger people listened with interest that wasn't nostalgia but curiosity about work that had shaped the landscape they'd inherited, about industries that had provided livelihoods before disappearing and leaving communities to figure out what came next. The festival became annual tradition, a way of preserving knowledge and memory while acknowledging that the past couldn't be recreated, only honored and learned from. The Samuel Crane Legacy Fund grew through additional donations and careful investment, expanded its programs beyond initial scope. It funded scholarships for 23 students in its first 5 years, helped 8 families avoid foreclosure, provided legal assistance to 12 property owners facing pressure from larger interests. The fund operated quietly, without publicity or recognition, following Caleb's principle that worth was measured through what you built rather than credit you claimed for building it. Liam grew through these years from frightened child into confident young person, shaped by watching his father build something meaningful from desperate gamble and inherited trust. He helped at the mill during summers, learned traditional skills from craftspeople who taught there, absorbed lessons about work and community that would influence whatever he eventually chose to do with his life. But he also asked hard questions that revealed he was processing their journey with more complexity than Caleb had given him credit for. Was it worth it? Liam asked one evening when he was 12, sitting with his father at the lumber mill as sunset painted the river in shades of amber. "All the fighting and stress and months we barely had enough to eat. We could have taken the first offer, could have avoided all of that." Caleb thought about how to answer honestly. Worth is complicated. The fighting was hard, and there were months I wasn't sure we'd survive it. But if we'd taken the Prescott's first offer, I would have taught you that principles only matter when standing for them is convenient. That powerful people get what they want when they apply enough pressure. Samuel trusted me to use his fortune to build rather than just survive, and honoring that trust required fighting battles I wasn't sure we could win. But what if we'd lost? What if the court ruled against us or we ran out of money before claiming the fortune? then we would have lost standing for something that mattered rather than surrendering without trying. That lesson would have been worth teaching even if the outcome had been different. Caleb pulled Liam close. I'm proud we won, proud of what we've built here. But I'm more proud that we tried, that we stood ground when standing was expensive, that we showed people fighting for principles isn't naive when the principles actually matter. 5 years after buying the lumber mill, Caleb received a letter from Thomas Prescott's son David, reaching out with an apology and a request to meet. They gathered at the mill museum on a cool autumn afternoon, David walking through exhibits that documented his family's pressure campaign alongside Samuel's history and the transformation Caleb had built. My father is dying, David said quietly. Cancer. He is maybe 6 months. He asked me to come here, to apologize formally for tactics our family used, to acknowledge that you were right to stand ground and we were wrong to pressure you as aggressively as we did. Your father already called and withdrew your claims. The fight is over. The legal fight, yes. But the moral debt remains. My family spent 3 generations using methods we justified but that were really just predatory acquisition disguised as business strategy. You exposed that by refusing to surrender, by making our tactics public through your fight. My father wants me to learn different methods, to run our timber operations through legitimate cooperation rather than legal pressure. They talked for hours, 2 men navigating complicated legacies their fathers had left them, Caleb inheriting Samuel's trust and fortune, David inheriting the Prescott family's reputation and the obligation to transform methods that had worked but that weren't right. The conversation didn't erase what had happened, but it created understanding that conflict could end through recognition rather than requiring complete victory or total defeat. The lumber mill property continued its transformation through the following years, each phase revealing more of what was possible when you invested in healing rather than just preservation. The environmental remediation was completed on schedule, contaminated soil replaced with clean material, affected areas planted with native species that would restore forest cover over time. Watching saplings grow where toxic chemicals had leached into soil for decades became a metaphor for the broader work. Healing required patience and investment and faith that time could repair damage that seemed permanent. By year 7, the mill had become what Samuel's letter had envisioned, a place that built connections and preserved knowledge and served purposes beyond what any single owner could achieve alone. The workshops hosted 15 small businesses, the museum welcomed thousands of visitors annually, the foundation had helped more than 40 families through crises that might otherwise have destroyed them. The property had been transformed from industrial ruins into living legacy, from toxic abandonment into demonstration that communities could recover from economic collapse when people invested in restoration rather than simply accepting decline. Caleb had been transformed as well, from desperate father buying foreclosed property out of pure necessity into someone who'd built something that mattered beyond personal survival. He'd honored Samuel Crane's trust not through finding the fortune but through using it according to principles Samuel had outlined but never managed to follow, building community rather than isolation, creating connections rather than walls, measuring worth through what you gave rather than what you accumulated. The land had witnessed it all and would remember, the desperate auction, the hidden fortune, the battles fought and the peace eventually achieved. It had taken Caleb's desperation and Liam's childhood and the years of uncertain struggle. And it had given back through transformation that proved healing was possible when people were stubborn enough and lucky enough and principled enough to stand for purposes that extended beyond simple ownership into the realm of stewardship and obligation and the moral duty to use well what you'd been trusted with. As evening settled over the lumber mill 7 years after Caleb had bought it for $425, he stood with Liam looking at property that had been dying and was now alive, that had been toxic and was now healing, that had been Samuel Crane's failure and had become their shared success. The river flowed past carrying water that remembered everything, the workshops showed lights from craftspeople finishing their day's work, the museum held stories that would outlive everyone who'd created them. The journey wasn't finished, the fun would continue serving families, the workshops would keep teaching skills, the land would keep healing through decades of careful restoration. But the foundation was complete, the transformation established, the legacy secured through choices that honored both the desperation that had led Caleb here and the trust that Samuel had placed in whoever desperate enough would prove worthy of receiving it. 15 years passed like seasons across the land, each one leaving its mark on the lumber mill the way water shapes stone. Caleb watched Liam grow from the 7-year-old boy who'd slept in a kiln house office to a 22-year-old man graduating from forestry school. His thesis focused on sustainable timber management in post-industrial landscapes. Liam had chosen his field deliberately, wanting to understand the science behind what Samuel Crane had built and lost, wanting to bridge traditional logging with modern conservation. The legal battles had lasted 18 months after that county hearing, a grinding process of estate proceedings, tax settlements, and challenges from parties claiming interests in Samuel's fortune. The Prescotts had filed 3 separate lawsuits asserting that Samuel owed their company money, that the hidden room's contents constituted abandoned property subject to different ownership rules, that Caleb's discovery didn't grant him rights to assets from a closed estate. Each claim had been dismissed eventually, but each had cost money and time and energy that tested whether Caleb would maintain his commitment or surrender to exhaustion. Helen Martinez had guided him through all of it, working on contingency but also on faith that Samuel's trust hadn't been misplaced. The final settlement had come 20 months after Caleb bought the mill, court recognition that the fortune belonged to him as legitimate finder and property owner, minus estate taxes and penalties that consumed nearly $200,000 of the $600,000 Samuel had hidden. The remaining $400,000 had been enough to change everything while teaching Caleb that wealth came with obligations that went beyond simple ownership. He'd used the money carefully, investing most of it in trusts and funds that would provide long-term security rather than immediate luxury. The environmental cleanup had cost $90,000 spread over 3 years, phased remediation that removed contaminated soil and treated the affected areas until the property met safety standards. Another $100,000 had gone to Helen's legal fees and the costs of fighting battles that had to be fought. What remained had been divided between education funds for Liam, emergency reserves for stability, and a foundation Caleb had established using Samuel's name. The Samuel Crane Legacy Fund operated quietly, providing support for families facing foreclosure, funding legal assistance for property owners being pressured by larger interests, offering scholarships to children of timber workers whose industry had collapsed. The fund operated according to principles Samuel had outlined in his letter, building connections rather than walls, giving desperate people chances that circumstances hadn't provided, honoring work and persistence rather than simply rewarding need. The lumber mill itself had been transformed through patient work that spanned a decade. The main mill building had been too damaged to restore, but Caleb had converted parts of it into workshop spaces for craftspeople and small manufacturers who couldn't afford commercial rent. The kiln house had become a museum documenting the region's timber history in Samuel Crane's final years, showing how industries rose and fell and what they left behind when economic forces moved on. But the real transformation had been in how the property served the community. Caleb had created a heritage center that taught traditional logging skills, that preserved knowledge from workers who'd spent careers in forests and mills, that connected young people to history that was disappearing with each generation. The workshops hosted apprenticeships in woodworking and timber framing, taught sustainable forestry practices that Samuel would have recognized even as they incorporated modern conservation principles. The river still flowed past the mill as it had for millennia, but now it was accessible to the community rather than controlled by private interests. Caleb had established public access points, created trails along the riverbank, ensured that the resource Samuel had protected would serve broader purposes than corporate timber operations. The financial security the fortune provided had allowed Caleb to work on the mill's transformation rather than scrambling for employment that took him away from Liam. He'd become a different kind of father than the desperate man who'd bought a foreclosed mill hoping for shelter, present, stable, able to attend school events and coach sports and provide the consistency every child needed. Liam had grown up watching his father build something from inheritance and choice, had learned through that building that legacy was created through what you did with opportunities rather than whether you'd earned them. Margaret Whitfield, an elderly woman who'd worked as Samuel's bookkeeper for the mill's final decade, had become an unexpected friend over the years. She'd contacted Caleb after reading Robert Chen's article, had offered to help document Samuel's life and work, had spent hours sharing stories that revealed the complicated man behind the hidden fortune. Samuel was brilliant at running the mill but terrible at relationships, Margaret had explained during one of their early conversations. He poured everything into the business, measuring his worth through board feet of lumber produced rather than connections maintained. His wife left him in 1982, his children moved away and never came back, his employees respected him but didn't particularly like him. By the end, he was running the mill alone, refusing to accept that the industry was dying. Why leave his fortune to a stranger instead of family? Because his family had given up on the mill and on him. They wanted him to sell, to retire, to stop fighting for an industry that was already dead. Samuel couldn't do that. The mill was his identity, and surrendering it would have meant admitting his life's work had been for nothing. Margaret paused. Leaving his fortune for whoever bought the foreclosed property was his way of ensuring the mill mattered to someone, that his work would fund purposes beyond what he'd been able to build himself. The stories had helped Caleb understand the man whose trust he'd inherited, had revealed that Samuel's isolation hadn't been chosen but had been the consequence of choices that prioritized work over people. Caleb had worked deliberately to avoid that mistake, to build community alongside the physical restoration, to measure success through relationships as much as through projects completed. Thomas Prescott had died 8 years after the county hearing, his final years marked by declining health and what family members later described as regret about tactics his father and grandfather had taught him. His son David had taken over Prescott Timber operations and had surprised everyone by reaching out to Caleb with an apology and an offer of cooperation rather than continued conflict. They'd met at the Lumber Mill Museum on a cool autumn afternoon, David Prescott walking through exhibits that documented his family's pressure campaign alongside Samuel Crane's history. The meeting had been awkward, two men navigating territory where their fathers had been enemies, where family legacies competed over land and resources and principles neither of them had established. "My father spent his last years regretting the fights he'd pursued," David said, standing before a photograph of Samuel Crane beside the mill in its operational prime. He'd been taught that acquiring property was proving worth, that the Prescotts measured success through acreage owned and competitors defeated. "That worldview poisoned 3 generations of my family, made us wealthy but isolated. Your father tried hard to take this property," Caleb observed without hostility. "Spent a lot of money on legal tactics designed to force me out. I know. And I'm sorry for that, both personally and on behalf of my family." David pulled out an envelope. "My father left instructions that if you were still on this property when he died, I should give you this and withdraw all Prescott claims to the land or Samuel's fortune." The letter inside was Thomas Prescott's final words to the man he'd spent years fighting. "Caleb, if you're reading this, I've died and my son has honored my request to end our family's pursuit of the Crane Mill. You won a fight I thought I'd win through patience and resources, stood ground I expected you'd surrender when the pressure became expensive enough. I spent years telling myself our tactics were legitimate business strategy, that aggressive acquisition was how industries functioned. Watching you refuse to quit forced me to reckon with methods I'd inherited but never properly examined. Samuel Crane and I were both timber men, both shaped by the same industry, both convinced our approaches were right. The difference was that Samuel built something and died protecting it, while I spent my career taking things others had built and calling it success. You honored Samuel's trust by standing for principles I'd stopped believing in, that ownership earned through honest purchase mattered more than ownership acquired through legal pressure. I'm sorry for the pain my family caused you and for teaching my son methods he shouldn't have learned. Use the mill well. Build what Samuel couldn't. And show your son better lessons than I showed mine. That legacy is measured through what you create and protect rather than what you simply accumulate." Thomas Prescott Caleb had read the letter twice, feeling complicated emotions about a man who'd died seeking absolution for tactics he'd spent a lifetime perfecting. The apology didn't change what had happened, didn't restore the money spent defending the property or the stress of those 18 months. But it acknowledged truth, offered closure that litigation had never provided, ended a conflict that had shaped both families across decades. David Prescott had honored his father's final instructions, had withdrawn all legal claims, had even donated to the Samuel Crane Legacy Fund as a gesture of reconciliation. Over the years, he'd transformed Prescott timber operations toward sustainable forestry and conservation easements, methods that preserved forest access for recreation and habitat rather than just commercial extraction. On a warm evening in late May, 20 years after Caleb had bought the lumber mill at foreclosure auction, they held what had become an annual tradition. The Crane Heritage Celebration, a day when the mill opened to the community, when families who'd been helped by the fund gathered, when craftspeople who'd trained in the workshops shared their work and taught traditional skills to anyone interested in learning. Liam gave a speech that year, his first after graduating and before starting work with the State Forest Service. He spoke about growing up in a kiln house, about his father's desperate gamble that had led to discovery and fortune, about Samuel Crane's trust that someone desperate enough to buy a foreclosed mill would use it better than Samuel had. "My dad could have taken the Prescott's first offer and walked away with a small profit," Liam said, his voice carrying the confidence Caleb had worked to nurture. "Could have avoided 18 months of legal battles and environmental cleanup and all the complications that came from finding a fortune he hadn't earned. But he chose different. He chose to honor Mr. Crane's trust by standing for principles that cost everything we had and that might have failed if we'd been less lucky or less stubborn." Caleb watched his son speak, feeling pride that had nothing to do with eloquence and everything to do with character. Liam had grown up with wealth but without entitlement, had learned to value the fight as much as the outcome, had absorbed lessons about using resources to build rather than simply maintain. Whatever else Caleb had done right or wrong as a father, he'd raised a son who understood that inheritance came with obligations extending beyond simple enjoyment into moral duty to honor the trust placed in you. After the celebration, as evening settled over the lumber mill, Caleb walked alone through spaces that had been transformed from decay to purpose. The main mill floor, once filled with rusted equipment and rotting timber, now held workshop spaces where craftspeople taught skills that preserved knowledge Samuel's generation had held. The kiln house had become a museum that documented not just success but struggle, that showed how industries died and what communities did when the work that had sustained them for generations disappeared. He climbed to the museum's second floor where Samuel's office had been preserved exactly as it had been in 1995, including the desk where the lumber baron had written his final letter trusting strangers with his life's savings. A photograph hung on the wall now, Samuel Crane at 40, standing beside the mill in its prime, expression showing pride and determination and the loneliness that came from choosing work over everything else. Beside it hung another photograph taken last month, Caleb and Liam standing in the same spot, the mill transformed behind them, evidence of community and activity and purpose that Samuel had never achieved despite decades of trying. The contrast was deliberate, a reminder that transformation was possible when people were brave enough to build community alongside industry, to value connections as much as production. Margaret Whitfield found him there as twilight deepened. She was 87 now, moved slowly but remained sharp, had dedicated her retirement to ensuring Samuel's story was told honestly rather than romanticized. "Samuel would be proud," she said quietly. "Not just of what you built but of how you built it, with community at the center rather than profit margins. That was what he failed at, what made his success hollow even when the mill was thriving. He gave us the chance to do better. Without his fortune, we would have been homeless within a week of buying this place. And you honored that chance by using it wisely. That's all Samuel hoped for, that someone desperate would be given opportunity and would prove worthy of it." Margaret paused, looking out at the river that flowed past the mill as it had for millennia. "You know, Samuel used to sit at this window during his final years, watching the river and writing in his journal about regrets and missed opportunities. He knew by then that he'd chosen wrong, that building a successful business while destroying relationships was failure disguised as achievement. Did he ever say what he would have done differently? Once. He said if he could go back, he'd spend less time measuring worth through production numbers and more time building connections with the people who worked for him, with his family, with the community that depended on the mill. He said the greatest wealth wasn't what you accumulated but what you built with people who mattered." Margaret smiled. "You learned that lesson without having to fail first. That's wisdom Samuel had to buy through loneliness." As darkness completed its claim on the day, Caleb stood in Samuel's preserved office, thinking about the journey that had brought him here. The eviction notice that had given him 72 hours. The desperate bid at a foreclosure auction. The hidden room and the fortune and the letter that had changed everything. The battles fought and won through stubbornness and luck and the help of people who'd believed his fight mattered. The lumber mill had given him more than financial security. It had given him purpose, had forced him to think beyond survival into questions about legacy and obligation and what you owed to people who trusted you even when they had no reason to. Samuel Crane had died alone, trusting that someone desperate enough would prove worthy of that trust. Caleb had spent 20 years trying to honor that faith through building community where Samuel had built isolation, through creating connections where Samuel had created distance. Liam joined him as night settled over the property, both of them comfortable in the silence that had developed through 20 years of shared experience. His son was leaving in 2 months for a forestry position with the state, preparing for a career that would take him beyond the mill but that was rooted in everything this place had taught him. "I'm going to miss this," Liam said quietly. "Not just the buildings but what they represent. The way people here remember Mr. Crane, the way they helped us when we had nothing, the way fighting for this property taught me what standing for things actually costs. You'll come back. This place is part of you now, part of what shaped you. And you'll carry those lessons wherever you go. That inheritance comes with obligations, that standing for principles matters even when standing is expensive, that the greatest wealth is what you build with people rather than what you accumulate for yourself." They stood together as stars appeared in patterns that had looked down on this land before Samuel Crane had built his mill, before the timber industry had collapsed, before Caleb had returned desperate and discovered that sometimes impossible gambles led to places that honored both the desperation and the courage it took to try. The river flowed past in darkness, carrying water that had witnessed everything: Samuel's success and failure, the Prescott's pressure campaign, the slow transformation of decay into purpose. The land remembered all of it, held the stories in soil and stone and the buildings that had survived abandonment to find new meaning. Samuel Crane had spent 40 years carving lumber from forests, had built an industry that employed hundreds, had accumulated wealth that should have provided security but instead had financed isolation. He'd died alone protecting a fortune he couldn't enjoy, trusting that whoever was desperate enough to find it would use it better than he had. Caleb had proven worthy of that trust not through finding the fortune but through standing for the principles Samuel had outlined in his letter: building connections, supporting desperate people who needed chances, creating community rather than simply accumulating wealth. The lumber mill stood as monument to that choice, to the idea that inheritance carried obligations extending beyond legal ownership into moral duty to honor trust placed in you by people who'd died believing you'd understand what they'd been protecting. 20 years had transformed abandoned buildings into living legacy, had changed a desperate father into someone who'd built something meaningful from opportunity he hadn't earned, had shaped a boy who'd slept in a kiln house into a man who understood that standing for things had meaning even when standing cost everything you had. The mill would continue long after Caleb was gone, would keep teaching and preserving and serving purposes Samuel had outlined but never achieved. The foundation would fund scholarships and legal assistance and support for families facing the same desperation Caleb had known. The workshops would teach skills that preserved knowledge from generations of timber workers. The museum would document honest history, success and failure, struggle and transformation, the human cost of industries that built communities before economic forces moved on. As Caleb locked the museum and walked with Liam to the truck that would take them home through darkness that felt comfortable now, he felt the weight of 20 years settle into something approaching completion. Not ending, because the work would continue, the fund would help families, the mill would serve community needs, the legacy would extend beyond his lifetime. But closure on the journey that had started with an eviction notice and had led through battles and discoveries and slow understanding that wealth mattered most through what you built with it rather than what you simply owned. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, witnessing the slow work of mills being reclaimed and fortunes being used wisely in families choosing to build rather than simply inherit. Samuel Crane had spent 40 years proving you could succeed in business while failing at life, had died trusting that someone would learn from his mistakes. Caleb had spent 20 years proving that trust hadn't been misplaced, that desperate people given impossible chances sometimes rose to honor them in ways that justified the faith placed in them. The lumber mill sat in darkness now, its museum locked, its workshops quiet until morning, its buildings holding stories that spanned generations and transformation that proved redemption was possible when people were stubborn enough and lucky enough and principled enough to stand for things that mattered. Samuel's fortune had funded that transformation, but Caleb's choices had determined its shape: community over isolation, connection over accumulation, legacy built through what you gave rather than what you kept. The land had witnessed it all and would remember long after everyone currently living was gone, the desperate gamble, the hidden fortune, the battles fought and the peace finally achieved. It had taken Samuel's labor and his loneliness and his final trust that strangers would prove worthy. It had given back through Caleb's stubborn refusal to surrender, through Liam's growth into wisdom beyond his years, through community built around principles that honored work without romanticizing the isolation it had required. That was legacy in its truest form, not what you owned but what you built, not what you inherited but what you chose to create from both the inheritance and the fighting required to claim it. The mill had given Caleb that understanding, and he'd spent 20 years proving that Samuel Crane's dying trust hadn't been naive faith but justified belief that desperate people given chances sometimes transformed those chances into something that honored both the desperation and the trust that made transformation possible. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.